You're looking good, and it feels good to be with you today. Hello, I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter, author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. Hey, leftover Christmas candy, just in time for Valentine's Day. So, this is, opposition and redemption. It's a very short read, and it's good because it's 2 chapters, so don't spend a lot of time and get bogged down. It's something we can manage. Plus, I think the best thing about this is that there's no Taylor Swift in this. So, first, 2 Nephi chapter 1. This is the transition where Lehi is aging, and we feel the march of time with the colony. The small colony is growing bigger and bigger, and there's more people, and it's time to pass off, to hand off the torch to the next generation, and that's what Lehi is doing. So it's like what, sorry, I got a message up on my tablet where I have my notes here. So it's like the father's blessing in Genesis chapter 49, or the blessing that Moses gave to the tribes of Israel in Deuteronomy 33. And it's interesting because you have the 7 tribes of Lehi. You have the tribe of Laman, Lemuel, Sam, Nephi, Jacob, Joseph, and Zoram. And then you have the sons of Ishmael. They're not quite into it. They get absorbed into the Lamanites, but those are the 7 tribes. It's interesting because Sam allies with Nephi, and Lehi makes a point of this. Laman and Lemuel kind of go together, but they do keep the distinctions. And but Zoram, that's the interesting one. As you read through the Book of Mormon, Zoram becomes a distinct tribe, and it has its own quirks and idiosyncrasies as we read about in the Nephite history. It's interesting to pay attention to. Is like for some reason the Zoramites didn't quite absorb in. It's Zoram married the eldest daughter of Ishmael, and I wonder if that had anything to do with that. Now, as Lehi talks, he talks about the land that they're in, and this gets into geography in the Book of Mormon. It's something I don't touch because we just don't have enough information, and people are passionate about it. But just to say, it's somewhere in the North and South America in this hemisphere. And as Lehi is talking, pay attention to the terms he uses. He uses promised, a land of promise, a choice land, a land of liberty. It is consecrated, and also talks about a covenant. And this is sort of a similar discussion we have with the state of Israel, and that God gives a certain land to certain people for specific purposes. And Lehi talks about this. This is also talked about in the Book of Ether, about the covenant and the terms of living on this land. That there's a distinct promise and also some penalties associated with breaking that promise and the parameters of obedience. He also talks about people who are brought to the land, and it's interesting because you come to the land 2 ways. One way you immigrate, the other way that you're born here. So it's if you're not an immigrant, don't feel bad. This does actually apply to you if you're a native-born American. So this is part of the law of the land, is that if you keep the commandments, you shall prosper in the land. And if you disobey, you'll be cut off from God's presence. Now that's interesting. That's repeated throughout the Book of Mormon as Alma, the younger, is passing off, handing off to his sons. He makes the same promise to each of them. And first of all, have you experienced this? If you live in North and South America, have you felt the Lord's prosperity in your life? Have you felt blessed as you've been obeyed or been obedient? But another thing to think about too is those are not exact opposite premises. Those are it's a kind of funny opposition because it says if you keep your commandments, you'll prosper in the land, but if you disobey, you'll be cut off from God's presence. So one is about prosperity here and now. The other one is about getting cut off from God's presence. And it's an interesting dichotomy and opposition and contradistinction. Okay, why does God puts those 2 things in opposition, that, you'll be cut off from your presence later on, although ultimately since, the meek inherit the earth, as the earth becomes a celestialized sphere, you can see how that applies to the hereafter. But it's an interesting promise to contemplate. It's not incidental, it gets repeated. Later, as Lehi is talking, he gives some warnings to Laman and Lemuel, and then he also gives an apology or defense of Nephi, that what Nephi did and how he treated his brother was actually God's will. And he wanted to make sure Laman and Lemuel knew that. And this is the question, is that Lehi clearly hands off the stewardship to Nephi. And you have this question of primogeniture. Laman and Lemuel. Laman's the oldest one, and you'd expect him to have this right, but this is a case where they ignore the primogeniture and go with the person who has more spiritual ability. That happened with, in other cases, for example, like the sons of Mosiah, and of course with Reuben and Joseph with the tribes of Israel. And then lastly, as Lehi concludes, he mentions Zoram. Now, this is something you think about with Zoram. I've read some people think that what Nephi did is Nephi kidnapped Zoram, and this is a form of human trafficking. Well, here's something to think about. Maybe what the situation was that Zoram was Laban's slave. These names get really confusing. And what Nephi did is Nephi actually freed him from slavery so he could own his own property and come to this land of promise. I guess this really comes down to, what did Zoram think about what happened to him? Certainly, it was a bit of an accidental. It's not the ideal. But if Zoram was a slave, that he got freed. It wasn't someone who was free became a slave. It's the exact opposite. So that's something to think about that. So that's the end of chapter 1. And let's go to chapter 2. It's a well-beloved, and it's a very philosophical one. And Lehi is talking to Jacob. And as you notice with the Book of Mormon, with the small plates, it's the fractilineal line. It's like in our dispensation. We don't have a lot of Joseph Smith's descendants in the church, in any positions or as members. What we do is we have a lot of Hiram Smiths, Joseph Smith's brother, most prominently Joseph F. Smith, Hiram Mack Smith, who was an apostle, Joseph Fielding Smith, who was president of the church, son of Joseph F. Smith, and most recently M. Russell Ballard, who was recently passed away, was a descendant of Hiram Mack Smith. And that's something to think about. That is, like in the Book of Mormon, in our dispensation, we don't have, it's not, Nephites' descendants went one way, or they don't have a record of it, and the small plates travel through the brother. And that's kind of an interesting thing, is we're bucking the trend. We don't have this, set line. It doesn't go to Laman, and then his descendants take over rulership. And it's sort of a sideway thing. And it's interesting to pay attention that God doesn't do things according to our notions. I remember once sitting by this is when I was an elder, and I was sitting next to a high priest, and the high priest had been in a bishopric and on the high council, and he made the comment that you should only call in elders if you could live in a ward for a year. So I made the comment, well, Howard W. Hunter was president of the church for 9 months. And, of course, it didn't take too kindly to be pointing that out. But, we have our notions, and God has his way of doing things. And if God wants to call a prophet for only 9 months, there's reason and purpose into it. And the same thing with not following the straight lines of inheritance that we'd like. Jacob had the second comforter when he was really young, kind of like Joseph Smith. It's interesting in the Joseph Fielding Smith manual. Joseph Fielding Smith mentions, I think it was in the 1940s, that he still hadn't had the second comforter yet. It just happens differently to different people. Then most of the chapter is this interesting deep theology, and this gives us a flavor of what we're missing from the 116 pages and what's on the large plates of Nephi. There's more to Lehi than we have, and he was a great prophet. Even though he would consider him a minor prophet, he packed a punch. So he starts teaching theology. He talks about accountability. Men are instructed sufficiently, and but also too that we're cut off, not just by the temporal law or the law of Moses, but by the spiritual law, the law of the gospel. And another annoying thing popped up on my tablet, and that we're cut off. And we need to understand the fall of Adam. And Christ's mission is to bring us back into the presence of God, which is kind of interesting. We talk about how the keeper of the gate is the Holy One of Israel. Section 132 talks about gods and angels who stand as sentinels before the gate of heaven. And these may actually be different processes. So this may be there's some process where everyone gets taken into God's presence for a length of time. So everyone overcomes the fall. And like I said, we don't have it's kind of funny because we're reading sort of different messages, and I'm wondering if these may be different processes where this isn't everyone automatically goes to heaven, but there's a event where everyone goes back into God's presence, and it's great for some people, and it's a miserable experience for other people, the people who are disobedient. And then he starts talking about punishment and law. And this reminds us of what we read in Alma chapter 42. And so you want to put a link to Alma 42 where Alma the Younger talks about law, how you have obedience, you have parameters of law, there's punishments and reward affixed to each other in opposition, and that it's just not happenstance. When you read the Quran, it's always, sorry, my glasses are fidgety. When you read the Quran, it's always Allah is merciful, and just by fiat, he forgives you and you go to heaven. But there's really not a law involved, not obedience to laws. I mean, you certainly have the 5 pillars of Islam, but it's nothing like what you read in the Book of Mormon. And then we have the very famous verse about opposition in all things. I think this is really interesting. Now, we understand we need to have an up and down, black or white. If we didn't have any bad experiences, we wouldn't really prize the good ones. And that's the context of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, plus our mortal experience. I think we will have a good handle on that. But I think this is a kind of hidden witness that there's a Jewish background to the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith may not have known about. That Jews believe that during creation, that God creates the heaven and the earth, causes the land and seas to separate, the waters above the earth, waters below the earth. And Jews understand that God's creating distinctions among things, that there's some differences. For example, Maimonides' says, Guide for the Perplexed, Book 2, Chapter 30, talks about this, and also Dennis Prager in his commentary, The Rational Bible, in the book of Genesis. He talks about how during creation there's just these distinctions. And here you have Lehi talking about the creation of Adam and Eve, and he also brings up the point that you need to have opposition, or you need to have these distinctions between good and bad. This is clearly someone who understands Jewish thought. And the question you have to ask yourself was this with what Joseph Smith could produce at that time, would he be able to come up with this understanding of Jewish thought? And there's something to think about, but that's how I see it. It's clearly Jewish thought, and here about opposition and distinctions. It's in the Book of Mormon. It's in the right place where it's talking about creation. It's also philosophical. Aristotle, in his book on metaphysics, his large volume on metaphysics, it's book 4, where he also talks about this, how you need to have oppositions in all things. Or you need to have opposites for stuff to make sense. Now, everything isn't both true and false at the same time. This is really deep stuff, and it deserves our repeated study and pondering. And it carries over to other parts of life. Are you being contradictory with how you deal with people, or your politicians? We have an election coming up, caucuses, primaries. Are we getting mixed messages from our politicians that they're making promises that they just cannot keep? Let's just really keep that in mind. The Book of Mormon is a witness of Christ, but it's also a witness of other things. Now you have this other part too, is that Lehi begins this chain of thought. If you say there is such and such, and you believe such and such, and this is what's called a reductio ad absurdum. That is, if you believe X, Y, or A, B, and C, then of course you logically necessarily believe X, Y, Z. There's certain things that entail from these original beliefs. And that's what happens. People sometimes don't think through their positions. I have a book on economics called by Thomas Sowell, and it's called Applied Economics, Thinking Beyond Stage 1, is that when you have certain issues, people just think about the short-term consequences, but not the long-term consequences. And the same thing with this, that if you do things a certain way, what are the long-term results, and how they, the law of unanticipated consequences. That's the things that Lehi is talking about right now. If you believe something, there's certain entailments. And if you believe something wrong, those also have a certain entailment. And what he's showing is you need to think through these issues. This is very deep stuff, and it will help you become a better thinker. Like I said, this is with Alma 42, but also when you study law, those of you who are political scientists or historians or lawyers, read Federalist 15. Federalist 15 also talks about the nature of law. So we talk about oppositions, and this leads us to a discussion of Lucifer and the fall of Adam. And then Lehi raises this interesting question. What would have happened if Adam and Eve hadn't have fallen? C.S. Lewis wrote this book called Perelandra. It's part of his science fiction trilogy. So he has Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and then That Hideous Strength. And this is the middle book. And what the premise of this book is that you have this person, his name's Ransom. He goes to the planet Venus, and he's there to prevent a fall from happening on the planet Venus. So you have the devil figure, you have an Eve figure, then you have a Ransom. Well, Latter-day Saints, as much as we love C.S. Lewis and we're grateful for him and been personally edified by him, he got that completely wrong. And part of that comes from a tradition he inherited from Augustine. In the book City of God, Augustine was a Catholic bishop in North Africa, but he was also one of the two greatest medieval thinkers, the other one being Thomas Aquinas. There's a book, The City of God, book 14. It says that if Adam and Eve hadn't evolved, they would have been in paradise and they would have had children living in glory. And what Lehi teaches is that Adam and Eve, when they were created in this Edenic state, in the Garden of Eden, there's no change. There is a static state. It was an equilibrium. So nothing would have happened. There's been no decay, but also for some reason they couldn't have had children with the type of bodies they had. Now, we don't have any explanation why that is. They didn't have blood in their veins. Don't know. And later on, it says all things are done according to the wisdom. And the guy says, okay, you just have to accept this on faith. But if you think about this, so Adam and Eve, there's no change on the earth. It was just there in a perfected type of Edenic state. And they could have had children. So there's no way you can really get evolution prior to the fall of Adam. They're just incompatible. They're just logically incoherent. And I've been around people who try and force the issue. For me, I just say, look, from these verses, we can't make a mesh. We don't have a lot of information. And like it says in the next verse, that things are done according to God's wisdom. And that's something you just have to accept on faith as an irreducible primary. And the state that Adam and Eve were in, there was just no joy, no sorrow, no happiness. They're just kind of a static state, equilibrium, fool's paradise, a gilded cage, lying in bed like Brian Wilson, just doing nothing. And then Lehi says, Adam felt that men might be, and men are, that they might have joy. And you understand that the only way you can have happiness is going through trials. As I filmed this about an hour ago, it was announced that King Charles III has contracted cancer. This is a guy who's been waiting his entire life to become king. Now he's king, and boom, he gets cancer. His mother lived forever. The minute he becomes king, he gets cancer. You pray for him, but there's just some weird irony about that. And that's part of life. That's the type of things we have to deal with. Okay, back to Lehi. It talks about things to act and things that are acted upon, agents and objects. And then what Lehi tells us, with all this theological background about the creation, the fall, the atonement, Lucifer, ins and outs of Adam and Eve's fall, he says, you need to choose captivity or liberty or captivity. That's what your choice is, Christ or Lucifer. And if you choose Christ, you become free to forever. But if you're disobedient, you'll be acted upon by the law. D&C 58:28, that's the great passage on agency. I'll talk about this when we hit the Doctrine and Covenants, is that there's a difference between choice and agency. Agency means to act. It comes from the Latin word agire, A-G-R-E, which coincidentally is the exact same verb in Portuguese, agire, pronounced a little bit different. Agitator, agent, agency. What an agent does, an agent acts as a representative of another person, or a secret agent acts on behalf of the government. And this is about acting and choosing. They're related, but they're not the same thing. So what we're faced is we're not choosing between flavors of ice cream or how to cut your hair. You're choosing between Christ and Lucifer. That's the great choice. Which leads us to the Christ quotient. Like I said, I'm kind of ramming through. I could make this a really long thing, talk about the philosophical aspects, but let's do this in small, bite-sized things. So the land of promise. Zion is North and South America. Keep Teaching of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 362. The Joseph Smith Manual, page 137. So, there is something to the United States of America and to this continent which is separate from the old world. I served my mission in Portugal, so I lived in the old world. 1990 to 1992. My entire mission, I saw 2 microwave ovens. One was in the mission home. Maybe 1 personal computer. After that, I had the opportunity to travel to Paris, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and then into St. Petersburg, Leningrad. This is about 6 months after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I saw what living under a Marxist government does to a country. I went to the bread store. The store was completely empty. There was no cash register. The 2 clerks at the store were using an abacus. Everything Ezra Taft Benson said about communism was 100% correct, because I saw it for myself. This is a different country. We need to preserve it. There's some statements by Brigham Young and Ezra Taft Benson about how the Stars and Stripes will be flying when the Savior comes. True, but also Ezra Taft Benson talked about, this country can also be damaged. We need to protect this is the headquarters of the churches in the United States of America. We need to be very protective of it so the church can function. These temples being built in Africa, it's the people along the Wasatch Front who are paying for them. It's the football team that pays for the university, and I hope we're all sophisticated enough to understand that we need to preserve our freedom here, our religious freedom. Make sure that churches aren't getting taxed. You need to vote, go to the caucuses and primaries and be an informed voter. Don't vote straight party ticket. Make a commitment to vote for one person, not of your party. And with American history, be honest about the bad, but also be honest about the good things. Okay, the gospel, Jesus Christ. Understand the 3 pillars of eternity: creation, fall, the atonement. Understand why we need to have Christ's atonement. You understand when you show up to church that your message should be about Christ. Church isn't a place to give hugs, slap back, sit back, and chew the fat. You're there to make covenants. You're there to discuss Christ. You're there to learn of Christ. The idea that church is sort of a nightclub where you show up to be entertained and fed, that's devastating. You're there to make covenants. You're there. It's all about Christ. Another thing to think about, the last thing, or another thing to think about, is obedience and discipleship. That when Nephi had to use his agency to get the plates and to build a ship, as Brigham Young said, we will have to go to work and get the gold out of the mountains to lay down, if we ever walk in streets paved with gold. That's the Brigham Young Manual, page 226. You want streets paved with gold, you got to dig it yourself and smelt it on your own. You're going to have to use your agency. These are tight times. You have to struggle with inflation, sitting down and working at it. Of course, you pray for blessings, but you also use your agency to cut back and to pinch pennies and understand correct financial principles and no get-rich-quick schemes. Lastly, freedom. People talk about freedom. I want to be free from constraints. There's only one way to be free. That's in Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ, as always, Jesus Christ, that's the point.